Oh, is everything fine now?
Okay, I see live at the very top of the screen, and you were frozen in time there for a second, but now I can.
Yeah, that happened to me as I said, press start broadcast.
Oh, okay.
Oh, technology.
I know.
If there's any viewers... Okay. Everything's working fine now, so... Okay, welcome everyone, if there's actually any viewers here. Welcome to my first inaugural live chat with best-selling writer Ronlyn Domingue, writer of books such as The Mapmaker's War and its respective sequel, Chronicles of Secret Riven. And before that, she has actually written a book called The Mercy of Thin Air. Are you frozen again?
Oh no, I'm here.
Okay. Oh, it must be just the way it works. It must switch off. When you talk, it must switch to you, just automatically.
Okay, all right. Patience, everyone. We're learning as we go.
Yeah, this is... I feel like a blind person trying to understand the way this works. There it goes. Oh, it's very fluid. I see how this works. Those Google masterminds. Okay. I guess I could start the discussion with a very generic question, because you know this is the most generic question that always starts at these sort of discussions. What really sparked the idea, let's start with Mercy of Thin Air. What really sparked that idea for that story?
Okay, let's see if I can make this short. Long story short is, many years ago, I worked for a management consulting firm, and I was one of 2 women on a team of 20 men. It was the best job that I had, but it was very demanding because I was, at their beck and call for all of their presentations. And one day, one of the consultants came in asking for his presentation ahead of deadline, and we had a good relationship, but sometimes he got on my nerves a little bit, and I turned around and told him, one day when I die, if you don't stop bugging me, I'm going to come back and poltergeist you. And that kind of stuck in my head. It's like, well, what would that be like to be dead and to have that ability to play tricks on people? And I didn't do anything with it for literally years. I mean, probably 15 years, if I remember correctly. And when I started writing fiction again, I took a short story writing course for free at Louisiana State University, where I was employed at the time, and that was the seed of the story that was sticking with me, and thus became the short story, which eventually became The Mercy of Thin Air, which has nothing to do with poltergeists, really. Ghosts, sort of, but nothing to do with poltergeists.
Okay, this is going to sound a bit disingenuous, but I've actually never read the book before, but I still was able to ask the question. Because I haven't had time. My time has been crammed with all these different works that I have to read for Book Expo America.
Oh, don't worry. I didn't expect that to happen, actually. I would have been surprised if you did.
Yeah, I didn't have the time. But I did read the 2 other books that were really discussing more in focus.
Yeah.
But that's actually very interesting about how that book originally, conceptually, was about poltergeists. And how did it... Was that just in a short story format did it start with poltergeists? Or did it change?
It was just the kernel of the idea, and it wasn't until I actually started writing the story, and it would be a lot more involved for me to talk about my process and how that came to be, but that was the kernel of the idea, and when the character showed up, I knew she was dead, I knew she was a flapper, I knew she was blonde, and I knew that she wanted to be a doctor. Like, that was Rosie. So whatever an idea for me starts out as in that tiny little kernel, it often morphs into something quite different, and that was certainly the case with the trilogy that I'm working on now.
So if we take that kernel, it's like, this is going to sound like a very corny, cheesy analogy. I guess to go with the generic question. But it's like the kernel being popped into a very good bag of popcorn.
Oh, yes.
Maybe very, but since your books are so sophisticated, it's much more nutritious, like air popcorn.
With a sprinkling of nutritional yeast.
Yes. Some of the nuance.
Yes.
But I noted by your answer, I extracted something very interesting. In that, what's happening on my side? My video disappeared for a minute there.
Uh-oh. Okay.
But I noticed that you talk in the two works that I've read by you. You've had some very. This is a good place to start because this is something I really, really liked about the first book I read by you, Mapmaker's War, which had a very feminist focus. If that's all right for me to phrase it that way, since I know some people feel uncomfortable with that term.
No, it is.
Okay, because some people think it's too totalizing, like, oh no, feminist. I'd rather have the term humanist or egalitarian, but
if I
go with this,
it ceases to be the work that it actually is.
Mm-hmm. And I was just going along with that idea even with that story, with Mercy of Thin Air, that character, you have these very, very progressive, ambitious female protagonists. Is that unconscious? Usually it is unconscious, but I'm not putting words in your mouth, but...
How did they come to be?
Yeah, how did they come to be, basically?
Okay, well, there are writers who plan everything that they do. That they are the masters of their world. They decide what the characters are, what they like to wear, what their names are, what their quirks are, everything about them. That's not how I operate. When I'm writing a story, I typically begin with some sort of concept that's sort of unformed, or a character, or both. And in all cases, with all of the books that I've written so far, and I would say most of the short stories I've written as well, I get that character as a person. I experience them as individuals, as people. I don't get to choose much about them at all. I can sort of maybe have conversations with them about, well, we need to work on this, and even that's not very successful most of the time, especially not with Secret or Aoife, the characters of the books in the trilogy. But that said, my characters are who they are, and I think they come to me because I'm prepared to understand them. In some ways I share certain qualities that they have. In some cases I don't, but overall I'm merely acting as the conduit, as a vessel for these people who want to speak to you and everyone else.
And that seems to... I mean, that makes a lot of sense for me as a writer, because that's the way I work. I feel like I'm getting telepathic connection with some transcendent thing out there. These characters that are floating around in some other universe. I know this is ridiculous, because I don't believe it tangibly exists. It's like these voices from my subconscious are speaking to me, and I'm articulating what they're saying.
Okay, well, we can have a completely different conversation about within and without, and the collective unconscious, and what is part of us, and what are we a part of, and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, we are unusual in that. I've spoken to many writers, and there was one particular incident several years ago when I sat at a table with about 7 other writers, and we were all talking about our process, and I was the last one to speak, and by the time they got to me, I realized I was the freak at the table, because the rest of them are very rational about the way that they approach their work. And in some ways, I don't want to use the word irrational, I'm intuitive. So I receive things and interpret them and share them. Where that's coming from, I don't know. If people don't believe in the woo-woo, that's fine. If they think it's coming from deep within you, that you're processing, whatever, it doesn't really matter. But I do know that for me, it is a much bigger experience than simply sitting down and making decisions about a particular story. I'm piecing together something much bigger than I am.
Yeah, when I write, I can't make rational decisions. Again, it's like, I guess you're a very intuitive writer. I don't write at all with outlines. I find them very limiting to me.
Okay.
I'm like, because it's. I guess that's what's interesting about your one character at the beginning of Mapmaker's War. How it starts with a character that has a certain disposition, I guess, like a creative disposition to create maps, and it's that creative outlet that allows her to sort of get away from this domestic life that's shared by her mother. That's how the story begins.
Right. Yes.
And her specific activity is much different than Secret's activity in the second book, for any of the people listening who've read that specific work.
Yeah, they're gifted in different ways. For Aoife, the narrator of the Mapmaker's War, she shows a gift, or at least an interest in mapmaking, from the time she's a very small girl, and she doesn't even realize what she's doing. But I don't know why I'm thinking of this, but James Hillman wrote a book many years ago called The Soul's Code, and in it he talks about how some people know very young what they're meant to be, what their purpose is. And I can relate to that personally because I knew from the time I was 8 I wanted to be a writer. For Aoife, she was very fortunate that she had the opportunity, as the daughter of a nobleman, to sit at the table to learn how to become a mapmaker. And in the Chronicle of Secret Riven, well, Secret's different in that her gift is she can speak to plants and animals. That's something organic. That cannot be taught. That is definitely part of who she is. And she does have her struggles with that because it does make her, of the many things that make her different than most people, that's one of them.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm going to probably mispronounce her name because when you read, you're not thinking of pronunciation. Alfie, correct?
Aoife?
Yeah,
Aoife. The narrator of Mapmakers, yes, Aoife. Yeah, it's a Gaelic name.
Mm-hmm. I guess her, in the certain type of society that she lived in, which I would say is much more slightly on the cusp of being agrarian, but much more kingdom-ish.
Yes.
That's not a word, but kingdom-ish.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess what was different was just her pure ambition, especially for being a woman at that time in a very patriarchal society.
Oh, she was centuries ahead of her time. When people ask me, well, what time period does the Mapmakers' War take place? I say, well, it's sort of like the Dark Ages, which is the easiest thing for me to say, even though I didn't have an historical period in mind, really, when I wrote it. But that's what it is. And she's had she not had the opportunity that she did, I really don't know what would have happened to her. I don't think she would have survived in the roles that would have been available to her otherwise.
And that's why the community, which I have a lot of stuff to ask about that, but we actually have our first question from one of our viewers.
Very good.
Catherine Patterson.
Hey, Catherine.
Hi, Catherine. We're so happy that you're here, and I'm going to read your question by selecting it, since it's the only question to select for now. And if there's anyone else watching, I really, really hope that you don't feel nervous. The nice thing about this format is you're not sitting in a room, so it's not as unnerving to ask a question. You just type it in. But Catherine asks for you, Ronlyn. She asks, do you find that being an intuitive writer creates certain difficulties for your writing process?
Oh, yeah, it's murder. It's really tough. I started working on this project, the trilogy, which wasn't supposed to be a trilogy, in October 2006. So I'm almost 8 years into this project. And as I work, I do use the word receive because that's what it feels like. So for the first few years I was working on this project, I was getting bits and pieces, snippets of dialogue, images which were incredibly loaded that might have just been, there's something that happens in book 3 involving birds, and I knew immediately when I saw that image what it contained, everything, the story around that image. There are moments that are incredibly beautiful in my process where I have these epiphanies, and there are moments that are incredibly painful when I experience very tangibly the pain of my characters. And I'm thinking right now specifically of Light the Warrior in the Mapmaker's War and what happened to him, and seeing, hearing, feeling the experience that he had as well as every other character involved or person involved in that particular moment that wounded him so greatly. So yeah, it's hard. There's also the times when I want to be writing or I want to be working and it's quiet. I don't get anything. It's completely dead. It's totally silent. And typically what that means is the story is working itself out in the background and it doesn't want me to know yet, or I'm not ready to know what it wants to tell me. And in either case, and later I eventually figure out which one it is, either way, the blocks are what are so profoundly difficult for me. And all writers experience blocks, but I think mine, because of the way that I work, are especially difficult to manage and frustrating, quite frankly. So, yeah. Catherine, feel free to ask a follow-up.
Yeah, you're allowed to ask as many questions as you want. Feel obliged. But thank you so much for your question. And we actually had a question from someone else. They posted directly on the event page, so I'm going to ask that for now. And there might be other things that popped up on there. But Richard, I don't know if he's viewing right now because he said, I don't know if he even has power, but we'll ask your question anyways,
Okay.
whether you're watching or not. But he asks, well, he said something about thunderstorms rolling in, so we'll ask this now in case my power goes out or have thunderstorms during the event.
Oh, no.
And, uh-oh, I hope you're okay, Richard.
Yeah.
But I hope you have power. That's always a great thing. Something we take for granted in our modern society, but...
Well, try living in the South with hurricanes.
Oh, yes. But Richard asks, I know you read Power of Myth by Joseph Campbell, which I have the whole video collection, by the way. I love that. I love Joseph Campbell. But anything else?
Anything else that I read while I worked on these books?
Yeah, I guess that's what he's asking.
Oh, okay. Well, when I first started working on the trilogy project, I was immersed in fairy tale, folklore, and myth, and that was a completely intuitive decision. I just felt led in that direction. Let me back up very briefly. What became the trilogy actually started as a short story, a fairy tale that I wrote in college about a young girl who lived in a kingdom where women weren't allowed to read. Fast forward about 2 decades later, I picked up that story, which I had turned slightly into a novel, but didn't know what I was doing, and suddenly realized what I had then was not what I had now. So we talked about the kernel. Well, I don't know what metaphor we'd be using at this point, but anyway, when that story started to shift and transform, fairy tale, myth, and folklore were extremely important to me. So I was reading Grimm. I was reading things I could find on the internet, all different versions of them. I was reading scholarly analyses of fairy tales, folklore, and myth. So I was kind of immersed in that world. In terms of actual books that I read, I was reading a lot of Maria Tatar, who very kindly blurbed the Chronicle of Secret Riven, which made me thrilled because I love her work. Tons and tons of C.G. Jung, one of his proteges, Marie von Franz, Marie-Louise von Franz, who wrote a good bit about fairy tales. Also read the Seamus Heaney translation of Beowulf multiple times. For whatever reason, I clicked with that and later realized what it was giving me was a sort of blueprint for the Mapmaker's War in terms of its 3-part structure and the fact that it's a legend. But it's different because Aoife tells her own story as opposed to someone telling Beowulf's story.
That was the interesting thing about the structure so far of this trilogy, and how the first book is really like more of the myth book, and that the second one is really, it really reflects the Victorian era in a sense, where you have an emergent sense that there is the world of fact, the world of observable things, and it's sort of like science versus myth, and that there's one side of people that believes that the new orthodox knowledge is science, and they just don't think that these two things can coexist in the world. Where someone like Secret, that's her real big distressing conflict in her mind. She's divided between the world of myth and knowledge, I guess, in a sense.
You know, that's a really interesting way to put it. It's true, because the world that Secret lives in, and for those of you who haven't read this book, the Mapmaker's War takes place in something like the Dark Ages, and then the Chronicle of Secret Riven picks up 1,000 years later, and the time period feels somewhat Victorian, somewhat medieval at the same time. So what was the question again? I just got myself...
Sorry. See, this is what happened. I had one of my tangents again.
Oh, the knowledge, the myth versus knowledge.
Yes.
That was it, myth versus knowledge. Okay, so...
Myth versus knowledge is a big thing in Karen Armstrong's works.
Okay,
Two ways of knowing things.
Yeah. So for Secret, she's living in a time where there's more technology. There are these things called telebells, which are you first wear in your belt, but then later the technology changes so you can wear it on your ear, and you give your bell toll. You're telling you're basically saying your to-do list out loud. There's street lights, there's water spigots, there's all kinds of things that didn't exist in Aoife's world, which is great. And to the degree to which they really have technology, you don't get too much into it with the Chronicle of Secret Riven, but Secret is very much an old soul. Her connection to nature is part of who she is, and for her, there's always this tension of wanting to be part of the world, of the regular world. She's a very bright child, very bright young woman, so there's that pull toward books and knowledge and information, and then there's that other part of her, that deeper part of her that's very true and real, that she's in conflict with because the world that she lives in doesn't believe in what she can do, so she hides it. So there's always that duality and tension for her that she can't quite get to work together.
Well, I've read a lot of stuff from the 19th century because that's what my one English professor who might be watching this. Mm-hmm. She's really well taught in the world of Frankenstein. And I just kept thinking of the character of Frankenstein's main dilemma. In the beginning, he has an academic one between alchemy and science.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because alchemy is the esoteric search for the ultimate truth. And science in its own way is the search for ultimate truth, but just from a different direction. And I think the challenge is to figure out how to marry the two. There really aren't that different. It's just, I guess, the means by which you get there. And alchemy, people used chemicals to do experiments, so it was sort of this, I don't know, I actually read a good bit about alchemy to prepare for these books too, even though you don't get a lesson in alchemy, but it's back there in my head as I'm writing all the time.
Well, I guess going off of what you're saying, I've noticed that more modern myths, the way that they're written structurally, is that there's a lot more clear tension between the world of knowledge and the world of like more arcane, esoteric stuff like magic, alchemy, and the ways of understanding nature intuitively. Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot more tension in that because that mirrors the postmodern dilemma. Okay. There's actually a question from Catherine. And that's something relevant to what we're talking about with the fairy tale aspect of both books. Okay. And Catherine asks, I've been reading a lot of fairy tales from various countries, and it strikes me that the Chronicles of Secret Riven seems to have more of a fairy tale voice, whereas the Mapmaker's work feels more to have a legend/myth quality. And is that intentional? Good question. I trust the books to tell me what they want, and Mapmakers wanted to be structured similar to Beowulf and have that epic feel, that very old epic feel to it, and the Chronicle of Secret Riven wanted to be more like a fairy tale. It's an incredibly long fairy tale, very detailed, very deep, but that's what they wanted. I wish I could be more cogent in my response, but that's basically how I respond to my work. It's, you show me your form and I will write it for you, and that's what I did. Now, I think that's understandable. I can't really talk about my work unless I just show you the book, and it's like, here, just read it and find it out for yourself, because I can't answer this stuff clearly unless I'm reading someone else's work. I think the observer has a much easier time. Well, and I think the longer you do this, the better handle you start to get into talking about your own work. So, I mean, if you would have asked me about the trilogy in the writing process 3-4 years ago, I would have babbled on like an idiot. But now I can kind of structure and remember where things came from, or just having recently looked through all the Jig Giant notebook that I keep to work on these books. I see where things came from, and so now I have a better understanding of really what happened. So thank you very much for Catherine for your excellent question. And I just wanted to go back, I wanted to return to Mapmaker's world a little bit more focused in a sense, because the one thing I just love is that scene when they first approach the community, and that the community is split by that river. And I just found that interesting. Oh, when she crosses over? Yes, that's a really, really interesting scene, and that seems to weed its way symbolically in Chronicles of Secret Riven, just a bit. That division, really, between those two places in a sense.
Oh, let's see.
Maybe not so much.
I'm trying to figure out how to talk around that, actually.
Oh.
Well, to address directly, because I don't know how much you've picked up yet, because you've read both books, so I don't know how much you've picked up on time and place.
Oh, okay.
Overlapping. But anyway, for those who haven't read The Mapmaker's War, which I'm going to here's the book. Very early in the story, a few years into Aoife's work as a mapmaker, she's told to go to the edge of the kingdom where there's a river that borders their land and someone else's land. And she isn't told to go across the river, but they do have a boat to go and map out the shore. And she decides to go across, which kind of sort of wasn't in the plan, but she does. And when she crosses the river and they get out, there are 5 men who come to the bank, and they don't speak the same language, but the 5 men in blue, one of them does manage to communicate what has to happen. And Aoife decides to go alone with the men back to wherever it is that they live, and she tells her men to stay behind. So she's pretty brave, I guess we could say, but the men don't seem to be any threat. And when she goes with the men, they do separate. She's led there, and the very first thing she sees before she enters is a road made of gold. And that's her entry point into a completely different culture and society, unlike the one that she is from. And she feels that sense of peace and connection so profoundly that she knows when she returns to her people that she has to talk around what she saw, because if she reveals who they are, she believes that they are in peril. And of course she's right.
And I think that there's another element to that with how she's entering, I guess, an alien society. As we've seen in history, people go into these societies. They could be like William Penn, which Aoife seems to be like William Penn, being able to really approach these natives and understand them more on an intuitive and really empathize with them and not see them as someone wholly different from themselves, where most of the patriarchal structure that rules over the kingdom within Mapmaker's War seems to be a lot more avaricious, and they want the material wealth that this community has.
Oh yeah, I mean, and that's what happens, is Aoife goes in as someone who's curious, as someone who is not a conqueror, and I'm not really giving away that much by saying this, but the people in her kingdom find out what's there, and the younger of the 2 princes, he really wants what's there, and well, the war ensues. So it is that split between live and let live, and I don't know, imperialism, a state of belief that one should conquer. I don't know what that is, but Aoife not only is different from the people that she was born into, and that she's very ambitious as a woman, but she also is, I don't know if she's so much a pacifist as she is just to let people be, let people live in peace the way they want to, and her actions in some ways almost destroys a culture, inadvertently.
And I think that, well, I hope I'm not spoiling anything. Now I have to be a little bit more careful that I'm not divulging anything. But is it okay to say that the guilt that she has over that, without, I guess, with being ambiguous?
Yeah, I think
that is carried through the first book. Mm-hmm.
No, I think it's entirely appropriate to talk about her guilt, because that's something she lives with profoundly, is, that, well, what if I hadn't crossed over? What if I hadn't gone with them? That knowledge that she played a part in what eventually happened. That's a huge weight for her, and it's something that she struggles with pretty much her entire life.
And I guess that has that whole, well, I'm not going to ask that because I totally forgot the title of the poem, so I'm not going to ask that. But I guess going back, you mentioned something about the pacifism element, which is something incredibly different from other books I've read, because a lot of books in the fantasy genre, unfortunately, they have a big emphasis on strength, clearly and linearly defined by violence.
Yes.
And it's very hard for me, as somebody who feels a little bit more pacifistic, in a sense, not like a strong pacifist, but someone who's looking more for a work that has characters that are able to excel with strengths that are much more of the mind and emotions, like emotional intelligence.
Right.
And that's what I loved about both books.
Thank you.
I mean, it's just something I absolutely love, because there's just not I guess we could speak about how why there still tends not to be very much pacifistic heroes in books.
Well, because we live in a patriarchal society that values violence over kindness. That values violence over compassion. I mean, I don't think this is really hard. I think and this kind of riles me up, and it's something that I thought about a lot as I was working on the trilogy, because I could tell that it was evolving into something that was completely counter to Tide. You go into any bookstore right now, and you're going to find dozens and dozens of titles of dystopian fiction. Fine dystopian fiction, and I'm not going to criticize the work itself, but I think it's reflective of who we are as a people, as human beings, that we gravitate toward these stories so intensely, and that they have value to the degree that we're living in a time that's greatly imperiled, and in a lot of cases by our own choices, and we struggle with rage and fear and confusion about this. And I think our literature is reflective of that and gives us a container to think about these things, to worry about them, but in the structure of that story, so we can go about our daily lives. But I was challenged when I was working on this trilogy after I read Oryx and Crake by Margaret Atwood, and I love Margaret Atwood. And the book is brilliant. It's everything I could possibly want a Margaret Atwood book to be. But what it did is it galvanized me, and it made me realize, what am I contributing to this world with my work? What am I saying about the world that I want to live in? And as I worked on the Mapmaker's War, or really worked on the epic project that was supposed to be just the Chronicle of Secret Riven, Mapmakers was on the side, what emerged was the story of, well, what happens if we do something different? What happens if we have characters with people who make different choices based on love and compassion? And that's what the Guardian culture is in the Mapmaker's War. Their entire society is structured on cooperation, peace, and love. And I can imagine people watching this are probably rolling their eyes, and a lot of readers complained about that particular part of the story because it wasn't believable. And I thought, that's not believable? We can't believe in a possibility of a world in which people live to help each other, to be kind to each other, but we're totally fine with books with bioengineering and blowing people up, and that's okay. I mean, what does that say about us? And then we get to the Chronicle of Secret Riven, which you don't get to see the extent of the transformation of her as a person and of her world until book 3, but you kind of see it set into place in that Secret herself is an introvert, which I don't think you get to see very often in books anyway. So, and I think for some people that's very hard to deal with, because you're going deep into Secret's psyche. You're with her. You're seeing her world. You're seeing where her traumas happen. Those traumas are important. That book wasn't written just to be long. That book was written to show something, because it's going to have importance later. And Secret herself is very kind and gentle, but then there's also Prince Nicholas, the prince, who is showing himself as he grows up to be a man who has the potential to be a very different leader from any other who's ever been. And it's in book 3 where they really show their true colors and their true purpose and opportunity to transform their world. And my wish is that these books get in the hands of people who are tired of the reality that we live in, who believe that there is something greater that we can do as human beings, as individuals, in the way that we treat each other, instead of falling into the status quo of the way the world works now. That's not how it has to be. And if my books present that opportunity and spark people to consider that and to perhaps maybe make different choices, I've done my job, and I'm glad for that.
Well, listen,
pontification. Sorry.
Now, that was very thorough and wonderful, and it's actually it opened up a lot of ideas in my mind as I was reading these works, because you probably noticed that the first review I wrote of Mapmaker's War, I did use a quote from Karen Armstrong's Short History of Myth.
Oh yeah, which I read when I was working on these books and read, and oh yeah, that was huge.
But I happen to be like a huge fan of her works, meaning I own everything, including stuff out of print.
Wow. Great kindness for used books.
Yes, and you have, if you've ever never read her one book, 12 Steps to a Compassionate Life.
I did. Yeah.
Oh, you did?
Yeah, a while back.
A lot of the attributes that she brings up, those steps that she brings up, are a lot of the things reflected in this work, which I found phenomenal. And I guess the one thing that what you said, what interesting thing you brought up, and it's something very vexing and problematic for me when I'm writing, because I'm like, oh dear, all my characters are all turning out to be introverts and they're all non-violent, because that's the types of people I'm interested in reading about, because there's not enough of them.
Yeah.
Oh, man, I just derailed there because I totally forgot the train of thought there.
No, I think what you're getting at is probably, are you struggling with the, I'm writing these characters but the world doesn't want to read them?
Yes, it's that struggle.
Yeah, hello, that's me. Yeah, I mean, I feel like that even now that these books are out and published in these beautiful bindings and packages. I mean, it's difficult to go against the tide. I struggle with it a lot, to be honest with you. If someone were to hand me a little pill and said, you take this, that stops, I might take it, because it's hard to be someone like me, or I'm going to assume like you, in a world that is very rough and cruel and kind of hell-bent on its own destruction. I'm not quite sure what role we have, we gentler folk, people like Secret Riven. I don't know what role we have. It still remains to be seen, especially since everything around us in our media tells us we shouldn't be this way. It's hard.
It is, because it tells you we should be following the Greek philosophy of the Stoics. We should be completely emotionally detached from things, because it's a lot easier to do that.
Yeah,
and that's what some people... what really bothers me is we're seeing a lot of dystopian books where people are in these very bewildering settings with zombies chasing them, and no one's thinking of the other sadness and despair that's in this world. You don't have too much of that because people are just running around trying to exact vengeance in some way.
Well, it's all about survival. It's getting, I mean, I'm going to throw chakras into this. I mean, you're dealing with first chakra issues, which is just basically survival. I mean, it's not until you move further up into the body and higher up toward the mind where you start thinking bigger about greater things and how you're connected to different things.
And that was, and see that tension that we both, I guess you feel really, when you're writing, when you wrote Chronicles of Secret Riven, really comes out and emerges in the character of Secret in this novel. In a sense. Yeah, the way you were talking sounded exactly like things I saw in Chronicles of Secret Riven.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. You're right.
That's
why I love having conversations with people, because it helps me see things that I didn't see before. So yeah, you're completely right. Yeah.
It's such a palpable thing, though, in the second book, and it's what makes the book so riveting, is that tension. And for anyone who's been in her place, or even someone who's felt any sort of tension with society, that's something that gets people into the novel and immerses them into that world and the psyche of the character. That it's not just about the fantasy world around her. The world is wonderfully structured. And it's interesting. We get those small little chapters within the book for all of you once you get to the second book, which is the way it connects to the first book is great, because it's so subtle and powerful. Once it you really start to realize how everything's so interconnected. But the one thing I loved is that in the second book you had those brief interludes where it talked about the actual world and the people in it. Yeah,
the town sections, which surprised me in the writing process, because those came, the town sections and the Myths of the Four, the Cycle of Myths and the appendix, I wrote each of those in 2 days. So the town sections came in a flood in 2 days. The myths came in a flood in 2 days. And pretty much exactly what you read is precisely what came out of my head or out of my hands, because I handwrite, at the time. And I don't know. I really love the town sections in the Chronicle of Secret Riven because it does create that distance. It gives you a sense of her world. On the outside, what's bigger and outside of her, and then when you return to her story, you're in her world. You're in that struggle of, where am I? How do I fit in? My mom's really cold. My dad's brilliant, but he's kind of weird, and so there's. And I think you're right that for anyone who struggled with being different at all, and we all do, but I think some struggle more than others. I think there's a lot to relate with for Secret, especially. For anyone who, how do I put this? For anyone who was a beautiful child who remained unseen, and maybe still is.
And there was also that element of the one work it also reminded me of the character's dilemma, in a sense, was very Wrinkle in Time-ish.
Oh, yeah, one
Madeline,
of my books. Uh-huh.
Oh, I love Matt. That's another author I love so much because she allows more quiet, more introvert, more, I guess, to the world sense, more eccentric characters to serve as the heroes.
Yeah, I mean, Meg's one of my favorite characters of all time, and I think it is that vulnerability that she has, that quirkiness, that kind of anger, because Meg's really angry. She's also really smart. And if I recall correctly, it's her anger that actually helps her toward the end when they're trying to save her father. So, yeah.
And that was really the first science fiction book, that and The Giver. It's so hard to find these books that are science fiction and fantasy that favor or have a preference for, I wouldn't say preference so much. I guess the better word would be that showcases the strength of a more pacifistic type of hero character, like Giver and Wrinkle in Time. And I loved those books when I was younger for that reason.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's nice to know that. And what's so sad about did you see the trailer? This has relevance to our discussion. But the trailer for the newest Giver film, they're adding in action sequences.
Oh, no.
I was horrified. They were getting away from... It's terrible. I wonder why Lois Lowry's not throwing a fit, or she's not indignant.
Because she can't. Because once you sign over the rights to the book, Hollywood can do whatever it wants. Anything it wants. So okay, well, they're making it appeal to those who may find the other material not as compelling. I'll phrase it that way.
Because it's a very psychological book. We get much more internal conflict with the character. That's what I found riveting about that book. And when I was older, I actually liked it more. Because when I was younger, I just wanted the action sequences, in a sense. Or the suspense, the superficial sense of suspense.
Right.
Like, you just want to know what happens. But you don't actually want the deeper story that unravels upon closer inspection.
Right. Well, but we're trained for that from the time we're little kids. I mean, we want the action, we want it popping, this is how it works. And to take a step back and to go into a slower book, or perceived to be a slower book, is a challenge for a lot of people. But I think for those who are willing to venture into it, there's a lot of reward in trying something different that way and experiencing someone else's world that they otherwise wouldn't visit.
What was I thinking? There's so many, but I'm always trying to find things I can say without really spoiling both books. So that's why I'm thinking a little bit, because I had a lot of other things to say, but they're a bit too explicit with the spoiler department.
Okay.
But what was I thinking of? Oh, I did want to go back a little bit to the community. What really was there anything in history that inspired the creation of the community? Any group, a real tangible group that existed in history?
Oh, of the Guardians? Okay, all right, now we get into the weird territory. Okay, so as I was working on the project, I started getting a sense of what the Guardian community was going to be like. And for those of you who haven't read The Mapmaker's War, the people who live in these communities throughout the world, they aren't connected by a nation, they're connected by a culture. When Aoife first goes to that one community, she experiences what they're like. And then when she's exiled, and I'm not really ruining anything, when she's exiled, she finds other communities like them. And as I was getting pieces of how their culture was structured, I was like, oh, well, that's interesting. I don't know why this is going to be in the story when it's really supposed to be about Aoife and this kingdom and all this kind of stuff. So it was a surprise for me. And then when the character Light made himself known, very dramatically, but anyway, it was through him, and I don't know how to explain this other than Light the person was encouraging me to read about Neolithic societies. And so I was like, okay, I'll start reading about Neolithic societies. And I did. And what I found out was that a lot of the things that was coming to me as ideas actually had an historical base that I had no clue about. So if you want to talk about the collective unconscious or whatever, it was very strange for me to have that experience of being able to look at what some anthropologists, archaeologists say was a time period in which it wasn't so much matriarchal, but that people lived in these very small communities where they shared with each other, and there was no peace. You know, the Mongol hordes hadn't come in to destroy everything yet, and I found that really interesting in that kind of strange way that my work evolves, and that what was coming to me had some parallel. And there's a lot of argument that those kinds of societies didn't exist then. Like, we're just making it up. Like, feminists are making it up because they want to believe that existed. Well, I'd like to believe it does, so I'm going to choose to say that it did. And that somehow that echo is coming back into this story and presenting us with potentially a model for a future, or at least communities, let's hope in the near future, that people can live in.
This sounds a bit, when you're talking about the Neolithic communities, I've actually, weirdly enough, heard of them because there's this phenomenal nonfiction book. I read a lot of weird nonfiction books about spirituality, especially early. But there was this book called When God Was a Woman.
Oh, please, of course. Yeah. Yeah.
That's a perennial work in
spirituality. Yeah, Eisler, read some Eisler, Gambudis, yeah, all of those. So yeah, they all dabble, and of course it's like, no, that didn't really exist, but we don't know because there's no written record for us to know one way or the other. So if the evidence shows that there were no weapons, then I guess we can assume they lived in peace, right?
I guess what people's skepticism probably does come from what's ingrained in our minds of what we accept as reality. People can only accept the reality where, this goes back to our discussion, because people can only accept something that's a violent culture, that we must vindicate wrong by using violence. We must always resort to violence to solve and rectify everything.
Sure.
And be in community.
Yeah, and obviously that's working out so well. You know? Everything's peachy. Let's keep doing what we're doing.
And I guess the way that what happens within the, I guess I'm going to try to be ambiguous with this.
Okay.
What happens in a sense is it kind of mirrors what happens with religions. Like the history of religions might start out, some religions like Christianity might start out with a much stronger pacifistic side until later in history, till Constantine comes around and screws up Christianity.
Well, that we could have a really interesting discussion about all of that at some point. But it's interesting you brought up religion, because I was reflecting on this recently about the myth cycle at the end of the Chronicle of Secret Riven. The myth cycle, let's see, how do I say this quickly? There's a cycle of myths mentioned in the Mapmaker's War about a dragon, a dwarf, a woman, and an orphan. And Secret learns those stories too, and she records those myths in the book, The Chronicle of Secret Riven. What I was reflecting on was that it is a cycle of myths upon which the Guardian community, or the Guardian culture, was created. And how interesting it was to me now that they actually live the values of their myths. So if religion is a myth, and I'm not saying it is, but if religion is a myth, are we living what's actually there or what we want it to be? Or, you know, what is the real story behind a particular dogma? And, you know, what is decided upon by man that we should follow? So, yeah, I think, I got a lot of thinking left to do on these books. But that's all that happens to my work.
There's so many things percolating in my mind as this discussion goes on, because I keep thinking of something I just saw last night when I was rereading some part of Karen Armstrong's book, probably a lesser-known work by her, when she talks about how sexism emerges in patriarchal religions, about Christianity in specific. But she mentioned that in a lot, and especially Christianity, with the Crusades.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That it was less so much loosely following dogma, or it's almost like they misinterpret their dogma to fit more with their neurosis.
Mm-hmm.
Like a certain neurosis that they have. They start straying away further. And I thought that was really interesting.
That's very interesting. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that work only has 6 reviews on Amazon. It came out in the 80s. Not a lot of people know about those works.
Yeah, but it also came out well before there was Amazon.
That's true.
That would explain it.
But if I mention that work, people are like, I've never heard of that. I've never heard people discussing things in that way.
Yeah.
Or is it that lady who's talking about that trite compassion stuff?
Oh, yeah, that stuff. Whatever.
But, and I guess the one, we only have 8 more minutes. Does any of the viewers have any more questions?
Speak now.
Yep, you have 8 minutes. This went by so fast. An hour is nothing.
It did go by fast. Well, do you have any other questions specifically about either of the 2 books?
Ooh, I guess with following our being tactfully ambiguous, just for the people who haven't read the book.
Okay.
But could you maybe give us some hints, some clever foreshadowing about what book 3 will be about? Not what will actually happen, of course not.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I actually can talk about that. All right. Well, the character Fumini, who appears in the Chronicle of Secret Riven, has a much greater role in the next one. So Fumini, the magnate who collects art and hunts wild game. Yeah, and I love him. He has a much bigger role because he's very much connected to Secret's destiny. The Plague of Silences, which is mentioned on several occasions in the Chronicle of Secret Riven, that actually happens. You find out what the deal is with the arcane manuscript that Zavet, Secret's mother, gets in this particular book. And you find out what the overarching connection is between Secret and Aoife. And I will give you guys a hint, which is not spoiling anything, but wherever you see an illustration, this is from Mapmakers, this is just one example, wherever you see an illustration in the Chronicle of Secret Riven, that's tying you back to the Mapmakers War. So you get to solve a puzzle as a reader as much as Secret gets to be confused about what's happening. And it's in book 3 where everything is brought together, where the whole is much greater than the sum of its parts.
And unfortunately, when I was reading the book, this is how my arc turned out with the images. Wait, can you see that?
Oh, no!
It obstructed the text. I could barely see some of the text in a lot of the segments. So I feel like I have to find a library copy quick.
Yeah, find a library copy, because that is kind of ruining it. Because what you just showed me is the very last town section at the end of Chronicle, and that little...
Wait, I hope nobody can see
swallow. Yeah, that little swallow is a small piece of the town map that's in the appendix. Did you see the map? Was it in your electronic edition?
I don't think so. This is what happens with NetGalley books if they have images. Sometimes the images don't quite work out.
Oh my gosh. Okay, yeah.
I should have mentioned it to the publisher.
Well, I mean, that's the thing. I mean, with
I was too appreciative of the fact that it was free, so I just put up with it. I was like, oh, this is the part of the perks of reviewing something.
Yeah, I mean, it probably didn't ruin it too much.
I didn't want to cause them too much trouble.
One of that, part of the overarching concept of this book was the use of those illustrations, of those images to tie the two together. So for people who are reading it as an ebook, I'm afraid part of the intent is lost, but oh well. That's why there's libraries with paper books.
I mean, maybe with the final copy, it might have been fixed. This was an earlier copy for those people listening, so it might have been fixed. The issue
so in the advanced reading copy.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's what happened. I don't think it's with the published copy.
Okay, I will ask about that because that's.
Yes. It's a little bit troublesome for us. Us readers who are like, what does that... I was actually staring at that text trying to discern each word.
Ooh.
I felt like Secret's mother trying... I hope this doesn't spoil it, but her one vocation is interesting. She's a translator of esoteric languages.
Yeah, you're not ruining anything, but...
Okay.
All right, yeah, that's an unintentional experience through the whole thing.
Yes, that's what I said. It's a wonderful experience because I got to really... get that sense of confusion and that Secret's mother must have felt during that time. It was a great. Maybe it was done intentionally just for the advanced readers.
No, I don't think so.
Okay, I'm just fabricating stuff.
Well, no more questions?
Is there any more questions? I guess not. Well, I guess we could wait a minute or two. Let's wait till 8:58 to see if anything pops up.
Will do.
But I guess I will say for now, thank you so much, Ronlyn, for conversing with me about your works. Your magnificent works. I really enjoy your books, and I really enjoy what you have contributed, and I hope more and more people read your books, because I will continue promoting this stuff like crazy, because I told everyone, you have to read this book.
Well, thank you so much. I greatly appreciate it, and I very much enjoyed our conversation, and am very honored to be your inaugural interviewee on your video blog here. So, thank you.
And I guess I should say this small little spiel for last minute. What I'm doing with my blog is I hope this continues. I've set a new precedence for having authors as invited guests through Google Hangout on Air, and as you can see, we had no technical errors, and I think this was a seamless process.
Yeah, this was great. I'd do it again, yeah.
This was phenomenal, so I guess I could thank Google, and thank you for not making me pay for this service, Google.
Yeah.
That's really important, since I don't get paid anything for this job I do. Having a blog and maintaining it, it's a labor of love and passion.
Yeah,
and I love it.
You do it very well. The reviews that you shared are incredibly well thought out. So thank you so much, Justin, for all the time and effort you put into it.
You're welcome. And I felt like I had to give something back for the books that you bravely put out in the world. And thank you again for all the people who watch this. This will be made available through YouTube in probably the next 15 or 30 minutes. It will be uploaded instantly, and hopefully other people will share it, and it will be so you can watch it anytime you want.
Wow. Okay. Great. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, and I hope you have a great week, and good luck with the writing of the next novel.
I appreciate it. I need it. Take care. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.